military airship Nulli Secundus made a successful trip to London from Farnborough on Saturday last. Starting at 10:40 with Colonel Capper and Mr. Cody on board, the airship, a huge sausage-shaped balloon of goldbeater's skin of 30,000 cubic feet capacity, driven by a 50-horsepower petrol engine, travelled to London at the rate of about 25 miles an hour, passing over Buckingham Palace and the War Office and circling around St Paul's. On the return journey, a strong headwind brought the airship almost to a standstill over Clapham Common, and its course was altered to Sydenham, where it descended safely in the grounds of the Crystal Palace. From the spectacular point of view, the experiment was a splendid success, as the airship passed over London at a height of only 750 feet, and at this stage of the journey seemed to be completely master of the elements. Journalists who talk of the conquest of the air, however, or declare that Colonel Capper's 50-mile flight has completely changed the strategic position of Great Britain, will do well to note that gallant officer's modest estimate of his achievement. The conditions of the experiment were exceptionally favourable. At the start, the pilot balloon we sent up showed that there was no wind at all. The slight breeze which sprang up was with them on their way to London, but the moderate headwind at Clapham prevented them from making any progress at all. Colonel Capper summed up the lessons of the trip by observing, "We have got a decent, slow-speed airship which we can navigate if the wind is not too strong, and which can be raised and depressed at will without the use of ballast. We do not pretend that what we have done today is anything first class, but we do say it is satisfactory as a first attempt." That was The Spectator on the 12th of October 1907, reporting on the flight of the first British military airship, the Nulli Secundus, or second to none. The Spectator was generous in its reporting. Nulli Secundus was, as we shall see, a failure as a military aircraft. But what she represented was important. The understanding of the British Armed Forces, finally, that military aviation would be a factor in future conflicts and was worthy of investment. In our story so far, armed forces around the world have hovered mostly just off stage, watching and evaluating the work of civilian pioneers. Pioneers who were often strongly lobbying for the military to take up their work. Count von Zeppelin, for example, had military uses in mind for his airships from the very beginning and, as we saw in the last episode, turned his nose up at the grubby commercialism of Delarg, the world's first airline. But even he at first struggled to secure the backing of the German armed forces. However, as the temperature of European politics gradually increased through the first decade of the 20th century, military leaders looked at airship developments in other countries and realized that they could no longer ignore them. When the next conflict came, it would bring with it a struggle for mastery of the air, and no nation wanted to be found lacking. This is the story of how the airship prepared for war. Welcome to episode 10 of Upship, the Airship History Podcast. I'm Nick Rogers, your captain on this long-haul flight through the fascinating history of airships. In our last episode, we looked at a critical moment in civil aviation, the founding of the world's first airline, Delarg, by the Zeppelin Company. Despite a rocky start, Delarg was a success, with thousands of passengers carried on hundreds of flights across Germany. But in 1914, at the outbreak of the First World War, Delarg's officers and men swapped their civilian clothes for military uniforms, and the airline's airships were press-ganged into service. This switch to the military did not come out of nowhere. For several years, the armed forces of major European powers had explored the military potential of airships from different perspectives and with varying degrees of success. On this episode, we will look at the attempts of Great Britain, Italy, France, and Germany to forge their fighting forces of airships. Although the Nulli Secundus, as featured at the top of this episode, was Great Britain's first military airship, it was not the country's first foray into lighter than air. As far back as 1862, British soldiers, having observed the use of balloons in the American Civil War, as we actually discussed in episode 3, recommended that the British government explore the use of military ballooning, a recommendation that took 16 long years to be enacted. When the War Office finally set up the School of Ballooning as an offshoot of the Royal Engineers in 1878, they gave command to Captain James Templar, owner of another spectacular airship moustache. There was a rather harrowing incident a few years into Templar's command. On the 10th of December 1881, Templar ascended in a balloon accompanied by two Conservative politicians, a Mr. Ag Gardner and Walter Powell, who was the Member of Parliament for Malmesbury. Departing Bath, they found themselves west of Bridport, rapidly heading in a strong wind towards the English Channel, so Templar decided to land. As he alighted from the balloon to secure it, the craft rose several feet. Mr. Ag Gardner jumped out, breaking his leg, but Powell hesitated for a split second too long. The balloon was carried by the wind out over the channel, and neither it nor Mr. Walter Powell MP were ever seen again. The School of Ballooning moved from Woolwich to Chatham to Aldershot and finally to Farnborough, where it was renamed the Balloon Factory and where the frame of an airship shed still stands. British balloons had played a small but important role in the Boer War, directing artillery fire during the Battle of Tagula Ridge and being hit several times by Boer rifles. Static balloons were all very well, but Templar, a far-sighted military officer, had met with Alberto Santos Dumont in Paris, and he had seen the possibilities of steerable airships. Seeking to develop an airship at the balloon factory, Templar lobbied hard for funding, and eventually, in 1903, he received the backing of a War Office committee to design and build an airship that could steer against a headwind, maintain its shape, and not leak hydrogen while being able to ascend to 5,000 feet. The airship that emerged from this process was the Nully Secundus, named after one of King Edward VII's racehorses and officially termed British Army Dirigible No. 1. I'll share an image on social media, but it's a weird-looking airship that resembles a stubby hot dog partially wrapped in masking tape. The semi-rigid design was also weird, with no internal ballonets, and in time this would have been revealed as a fatal design flaw had the airship ever attempted to actually reach 5,000 feet. A gondola of light steel tubes was suspended from the envelope by a harness of silk bands, and a single engine bought from Paris was installed on this structure along with horizontal elevators at the bow, stern and amidships, and a rudder at the stern. By the time of Nully Secundus's first flight in September 1907, Colonel Templar had been replaced by Colonel John Capper as commander of the balloon factory. Capper was already a highly decorated Royal Engineers officer, having served in critical logistics roles in the Boer War when he was transferred to the balloon factory. It was Colonel Capper, along with Samuel Cody, the Iowa cowboy turned aviation impresario, yet another member of the cast of weird and wonderful characters from the early days of aviation, who piloted the Nully Secundus on her flight over London, a flight designed to generate publicity for the balloon factory. It was very much a story of two halves. As the Spectator related, the airship really did get people's attention when it flew over central London. However, the Nully Secundus couldn't make it back to Farnborough against a headwind and had to land at Crystal Palace, where it was later damaged by high winds, deflated, and taken back to Farnborough by rail. The components of the airship were refashioned into a larger ship called the Nully Secundus II, so is that still second to none? I'm not quite sure, which only flew twice before being scrapped in 1908. Despite the failure of the Nully Secundus and its successor, the lobbying efforts of Templar and later Capper had paid off. The War Office was now firmly on board with the military potential of airships. It was determined that the Navy would develop rigid airships, while the Army would continue to develop smaller, non-rigid designs, and in 1909 the cutely named Baby was christened, a 25-metre-long fish-shaped machine with inflated fins that was later enlarged and renamed Beta. And as beta, she was a success as far as she went. She became the first airship to be inspected by King George V. She participated in successful mooring mast trials. She carried the Prince of Wales and was even used for parachute jumping. But she was just too small to have any real military usefulness. The Army went on to build 3 more non-rigid airships called Gamma, Delta, and Eta. Gamma had a distinctive bright yellow envelope and incorporated effective swivelling propellers like those championed by E.T. Willows. Her career was a little lackluster, as were those of her successors. Used for short local training flights and experiments, the Army's interest in airships dwindled, and when responsibility for airships was passed in totality to the Royal Navy in 1913, these airships were rarely flown, and they were all scrapped in 1916. But the Army hadn't just relied on homegrown airships. They had, in fact, operated a couple of French-built ships, almost against their will. A parliamentary committee composed of enthusiastic but amateurish politicians had essentially forced the War Office to buy an airship manufactured by the French Clement Bayard company. And this was a dismal failure. The airship was flown over from France in October 1909 and proved itself to be unreliable and lacking manoeuvrability. It also leaked hydrogen at a prodigious rate. In the end, the airship was never used because the Army didn't have a shed big enough to house it. A rather ignominious episode, but by no means the only time that political interference would cause headaches for British airshipmen. The second airship thrust upon the Army was a semi-rigid manufactured by the Lebaudy brothers, who we will look at later in the episode. The airship was bought in a patriotic gesture by the Morning Post newspaper and flown over from France in October 1910 and was sadly another failure. She was damaged while being taken into her shed, the roof of which was 10 feet too low after someone got the airship's dimensions wrong. She was repaired and then on the 4th of May 1911 pulled free of her ground crew, burst her envelope and fell on some houses near Farnborough, causing £4,000 worth of damage that the Treasury refused to pay for. Thus ended the career of the Morning Post Lebaudy. While the Army was the initial focus of British airship development, it became clear that the future lay with the Royal Navy. Senior naval officers had already noted that German Zeppelins could perform long-range, long-endurance flight, exactly the sort of capabilities that the Royal Navy could utilise. Plus, Colonel Capper had gazed into his crystal ball and predicted that Zeppelins of the future would be effective strategic bombers, and so would threaten British cities, factories, ships, and other vital assets. Proposals, therefore, for a British naval rigid airship were submitted to Admiral Fisher, the First Sea Lord, who forwarded them to the Cabinet with Admiralty approval. The proposals were signed off in February 1909 by the Committee of Imperial Defence and supported by the Treasury, which had approved $35,000 for a rigid airship. This was seen as good value compared with the £80,000 price tag of a naval destroyer. The contract for the new rigid was given to the Vickers Company, who at that time were intimately involved in the Royal Navy's submarine programme. Design work for His Majesty's Airship No. 1, and what an amazing science fiction style name that is, was completed by a blended team of Royal Naval officers and Vickers staff. Considering how little the team actually knew, much of the work was based on Vickers' submarine experience, the design was quite far-sighted in order to meet the Admiralty's specification, which was for an airship capable of travelling at 40 knots for 24 hours, operating at a height of 1,500 feet, with a crew of 20, and, crucially, for the scouting role, fitted with wireless equipment. The ship, which came to be cynically nicknamed Mayfly, after the insect that lives for only one day, featured a keel running the length of the underside of the airship, into which was built a small day cabin for the crew and the all-important wireless equipment. In a genuine innovation, No. 1 became the first airship to carry mooring equipment in her nose, designed to be attached to a mooring mast. She was also constructed out of a new alloy called duralumin. This would become the standard metal for rigid frames of Zeppelins, but not for several years. The airship was built in a floating hangar in Barrow-in-Furness, completed in early 1911 after serious delays. Trials inside the shed found she was significantly overweight, and this was confirmed when she was taken out of her shed for the first time in May and docked at her floating mooring mast. For the 4 days she was there, she showed no sign whatsoever of wanting to rise into the air. This was not helped by the gas inside the airship being stale and impure. Major surgery was required. The crew cabin went, as did the forward elevators and the water recovery mechanism. The need to save weight was so extreme that the keel was removed, with one of the designers warning that this would have severe implications for the airship's structural integrity. The team was so desperate that they drilled holes in the engine levers to make them lighter. Finally, on the 24th of September 1911, having been topped up with hydrogen and provisionally accepted by the Admiralty, number 1, which was 156 metres long, 14 metres in diameter, was eased once again out of her shed. But she was never to leave the ground. As she had just cleared her shed, a forceful gust of wind struck her and pushed her onto her side. Righting herself, the ground crew heard ominous cracking sounds from amidships, and as they watched, the airship's back broke. The two halves began to rise, but the crew in the rear gondola dove overboard, and the stern settled, pointing up into the air. No one was injured, but later that day there was an attempt to pull her back into the shed to make repairs, which caused even more damage, and the airship was deemed a total loss. It seemed certain that the removal of the keel fatally weakened the airship, leaving it incapable of withstanding even a single gust of wind. Although the Royal Navy and Vickers team were absolved of blame by the subsequent Court of Inquiry, the officer in charge visited the wreckage and deemed His Majesty's Airship No. 1 the work of a lunatic. Although No. 1 was a failure, she represented the boldness of vision and willingness to innovate that had always been the hallmark of the Royal Navy. The first rigid airship constructed outside Germany, and with some highly innovative and forward-thinking design features, I think she can be classed as a noble failure. The loss of No. 1 left the Royal Navy with no airships and the Admiralty in two minds about how to proceed. Sometimes they wanted to pack the whole thing up, but at other times they displayed intense interest. In November 1911, they sent two senior officers on a fact-finding mission to Germany. They flew aboard the new Zeppelin Schwaben and inspected the Parseval works. On their return, the Admiralty even considered entering into negotiations to buy a Zeppelin, but the German government forbade the sale of Zeppelins to foreign countries for reasons of national security. Underscoring the equivocal attitude of the Admiralty, yet another fact-finding mission was made the following year, with two different officers travelling again to Germany, Austria and France, this time sort of semi-undercover. They flew on de Largue's Victoria Louise, visited Zeppelin's rigid airship competitor Shooter Lance, flew on a Parseval non-rigid in Austria and on an Astra Torres non-rigid in France, and on their return they actually recommended that the Royal Navy purchase one of each of those non-rigid types. In their report, the two officers essentially sounded the alarm bell. They had seen firsthand how advanced German and French aeronautics were, and they had an insight into how imperative it was for Britain to remain in the race. Negotiations began in 1912, and in June 1913, the Royal Navy took delivery of the Astra Torres No. 14, designated His Majesty's Airship No. 3, and PL-18, manufactured by Parseval and designated Naval Airship No. 4. Both foreign-built airships appeared with the homegrown airships Gamma and Delta at the Spithead Naval Review in 1914 in front of King George, and both performed well under Royal Naval Command. Those were the Royal Navy's non-rigid airships, but there was still interest in rigid airships. After much back and forth, an order was placed with Vickers for a 160-metre long, 16-metre diameter, 24,000 cubic metre rigid airship that would ultimately become His Majesty's Airship No. 9. The design of this ship was significantly influenced by the forced landing and subsequent inspection of a German Army Zeppelin in France in 1913, something that we'll take a look at after the break. Construction of HMA No. 9 began in March 1914, but it was disrupted by the outbreak of war, and she would not be completed until November 1916. So with the outbreak of war in August 1914, Great Britain found herself severely lacking in military airships. The Royal Navy could draw on 2 new but foreign-built non-rigid airships, 4 small, essentially obsolete and operationally useless home-built non-rigids, and none of the large rigid airships that Germany was beginning to crank out in large numbers. Great Britain would need to catch up, and quickly. Although several countries around the world were experimenting with the military possibilities of airships before the First World War, only one country had actually fought an enemy with their airships, and that was Italy. From the beginning of its engagement with the technology, Italy had approached the problem from a unique perspective, early on adopting the semi-rigid style and sticking to it strongly throughout. Semi-rigids have a flexible envelope like non-rigids, which are also known as blimps, but they also have a rigid keel that runs along the underside of the airship. The keel helps the airship to keep its shape and is used to support the gondola and engines. Italian semi-rigid airships form the basis of some of the most dramatic airship stories in history, specifically 2 expeditions to the North Pole that we will cover in great detail in Season 3. But initially, their purpose was decidedly military. The first Italian military airship, the N1, was built by the Italian Air Ministry in 1908 on the shores of Lake Bracciano, northwest of Rome, at a site that is the modern-day location of the Italian Air Force Museum. She was 63 metres long, had a gas capacity of 2,750 cubic metres, and was something of a success, reaching speeds of 25 miles an hour and holding her own against headwinds. The increasingly large airships built by the Air Ministry were complemented by airships built privately by the Italian pioneer Enrico Forlanini, whose second airship, the Città di Milano, was one of the first airships to have the gondola directly attached to the envelope, which reduced air resistance, and it was bought by the Italian army. Italy's main pre-war contribution was to offer an insight into what airships could achieve on the battlefield in the Italo-Turkish War against the Ottoman Empire that broke out on the 29th of September 1911 over Italian claims in Libya. It was an unpleasant war that foreshadowed what was to follow in Europe, with trench warfare, brutal irregular warfare, and the introduction of new military technology. Much of the new technology was aerial in nature, featuring the first aeroplane reconnaissance flights and the first aeroplane bombing missions. Airships played their role too, with the semi-rigid airships P2 and P3 making 127 operational flights against the Turks, carrying out reconnaissance and bombing enemy positions. The airships were transported by steamship to Tripoli, and on the 6th of March 1912 they both went into action at Janzur, west of Tripoli, flying in concert over Turkish positions and bombing them from 6,000 feet, an action that was captured in an extraordinary photograph. The war ended in October 1912 with a fairly convincing Italian victory. By the outbreak of the First World War, Italy had built up a modest fleet of airships, their crews the only airshipmen in the world actually tested in battle. The Italians had entrenched their expertise in the semi-rigid style, but most importantly, they had offered a glimpse into the brutal, deadly aerial warfare that was to follow. After the break, we will travel to France to look at how their airshipmen prepared for war, and then, perhaps most importantly, we will return to Germany, whose armed forces were developing a fierce fighting force of airships. Leaving the control car after a flight late on the 31st of July 1914, I was handed a telegram ordering me to keep the Sarchen within 50 miles of base. War! We had never given much thought to war. We had been too busy with our airships. For my part, though I had been a naval constructor in the Imperial shipyards at Kiel and was now in the reserve, I could not believe that a conflict between the great powers would really materialize. In fact, a career in the Navy had not promised the excitement I craved, and that was why I had joined Count Zeppelin's organization some 16 months before. In that period, I had piloted the commercial Zeppelins on hundreds of flights, and there had been plenty of excitement. Though a flight might be as quiet and peaceful as the lives of the tourists we carried on sightseeing trips, the operation of an airship itself was thrilling. Now, as I pulled my naval lieutenant's uniform from the bottom of a trunk, I wondered what the war would bring. What would be done with the airships? That was Captain Ernst Lehmann in his 1927 autobiography, The Zeppelins. Lehmann, a dapper and charming character, would go on to become one of the most important, if sometimes controversial, figures in the airship story. But with that said, I'm not sure I quite believe him when he says that Zeppelin staff hadn't given much thought to war. As we've seen, Count von Zeppelin himself always had the military potential of his airships uppermost in his mind, and the airline de Largue effectively became an instrument for training future military airship crews. The Imperial German military had a very clear plan to expand their airship capabilities and were working with several different manufacturers towards that end. One of the main drivers of German airship development was their ongoing rivalry with, and near pathological fear of, France. By this stage, the French airship industry was sophisticated and advanced. 4 main private companies, mostly working with non-rigid, had pushed airship technology forward in terms of size, speed, and endurance, with the full-throated support of the French military establishment. We've already met the most venerable of these French companies, the Lebaudy brothers, originally sugar refiners who built the short-lived Morning Post airship for the British Army. They began building their series of semi-rigid airships in 1902, all with highly distinctive designs. If you've ever seen the amazing 1974 Disney live-action movie The Island at the Top of the World, the airship featured in that, the Hyperion, looks very similar to Lebaudy's airships, with pointy ends and a brightly coloured envelope. Their first airship was nicknamed Le Jeune due to her bright yellow envelope. After a few rebuilds, Le Jeune went to the French army, donated as a gesture of patriotism, the first of ultimately 7 that were delivered to their domestic military, along with 2 that were sold to the Russian army and 1 that was sold to the Austrian army. The first Lebaudy airship actually commissioned by the French army, in fact the first airship of any kind ordered by the French military, was christened Patrie and launched in November 1906. 60 metres long, 10 metres in diameter, with a gas capacity of 3,300 cubic metres and a crew of 4, Patrie was shown off to the French public in a publicity flight over central Paris in December. Patrie was flown hard through 1907 and on one memorable occasion carried Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau and Minister of War Georges Picquart. On this flight, a pipe burst, showering Clemenceau with hot water, but doing nothing to diminish his praise for the airship. Patrie was based at the fortress of Verdun, but the night of the 29th of November 1907 found her grounded in a nearby village with mechanical issues. A ground crew of 200 soldiers were babysitting, but a fierce storm blew up, and the following morning Patrie was ripped from her moorings and blown to the northwest, thankfully with no one on board. Nothing was seen or heard of her for 2 days, until she was sighted off the coast of Wales, before briefly touching down in County Down, Ireland, where one of her propellers fell off. Rising again, she drifted north. The last reported sighting was from a trawler off the Mull of Kintyre, and after that she was never seen again. Undaunted by this rather strange loss, the French army commissioned 3 airships of the same design from the Lebaudy brothers. The next to be delivered, christened La République, slightly larger than Patrie, broke an endurance record early in her career, but she was a short-lived addition to the French fleet. While returning to base after participating in that year's army manoeuvres, a propeller blade sheared off and tore through the envelope. The loss of gas caused La République to fall out of the sky, crashing to the ground and killing all 4 crew members. In a race with the Germans, the French army aimed for a fleet of 18 airships. 4 more were ordered from Lebaudy, but other companies were putting their shoulders to the wheel of this national endeavour. The Zodiac Company, originally founded in 1896 to manufacture hydrogen balloons, began producing airships in 1909. Although their intended market was commercial and sporting rather than military, they built 6 small non-rigids for the French army and also had the distinction of building the only French rigid airship. Launched in 1913, the airship, named Space after the company's senior designer, was not a success. The wooden-framed rigid did not have enough lift, even after being enlarged, and it was scrapped in 1914 before the war commenced. Possibly the most important French airship manufacturer was the Astra company, which built several airships of its own design, but also collaborated with other designers to build a range of often unique airships. Most notably, they joined forces with a remarkable Spanish inventor and polymath, Leonardo Torres Quevedo. Torres turned his hand to many different areas of technology, including cable cars, calculating machines, and even early radio control. He created a radio-controlled tricycle in 1904 and a radio-controlled boat the following year. But he also put his considerable mind to work on airship designs, trying to reduce the drag caused by all the wires, ropes, and rigging that usually hung down between the gondola and the envelope. His solution was a highly distinctive tri-lobe design, like a cloverleaf, which moved most of the rigging inside. The Astra company seized on this and put it to use in a series of military airships. As we shall see in Season 2, the design was also imitated successfully by the British. Finally, Astra collaborated with industrialist Adolphe Clement Bayard on a series of airships, a number of which saw service in the war, and one of which made the first airship flight across the Channel from France to Britain. As the First World War loomed into view, France enjoyed the second largest fleet of military airships in the world, behind Germany and ahead of Italy, with Britain trailing far behind. But my impression is that the French High Command was not entirely sure how this fleet would be deployed in war. They dismissed the need for rigid airships. As a land power, they looked to their eastern border, and so there was no requirement for aircraft with the range and endurance of rigid airships, and besides, their only attempt at building one had been a costly failure. Mostly, they built airships because Germany was building airships. This was an aerial arms race, and as with all arms races, there was a chicken and egg quality to it. Where it started and where it would stop, no one quite knew. But towering above all other nations, leading the world in airship development was, of course, Germany. In the podcast so far, we have focused heavily, and for good reason, on the Zeppelin company. But the Count was by far from the only figure in the German airship industry. He wasn't even the only German manufacturer of rigid airships, as we shall see. We have already met one of the most important German airship manufacturers, and Count von Zeppelin's chief rival, Major August von Parsifal. An army reserve officer from a military family, Parsifal had a long-standing interest in aviation and followed a program of self-study of mechanics and mathematics. He founded the first German balloon factory in 1897, setting himself to the task of improving military observation balloons. In previous episodes, I've spoken about how tethered gas balloons were used by armies around the world to monitor enemy movements, spot for artillery, and so on. These round balloons had a critical flaw, which was that even in light winds, they would be blown off the vertical and lose height. Parsifal developed the concept of a kite balloon, one shaped a bit like a sausage, and that in any wind acted like a kite without the tendency to lose height. The concept was adopted into the German army, and kite balloons were used in large numbers during the First World War. After the flight of the first Zeppelin in 1900, Parsifal began working on a steerable version of the kite balloon for military reconnaissance purposes. It had to be small, light, and easily transportable, basically the opposite of Zeppelin's rigid behemoths. The airship flew on the 26th of May 1906 and performed well, flying multiple figures of 8 in moderate winds in the presence of the War Minister and members of the Imperial General Staff. And with the support of the War Ministry, Parseval continued to develop his designs, and a company was founded in 1908 in Bitterfeld, southwest of Berlin. The second airship was taken over by the army, the first of many Parseval airships to see military service in a number of different countries, including Britain, Austria, Turkey, Italy, Russia, and even Japan. Kaiser Wilhelm himself showed a great interest in Parseval's airships, turning out several times to inspect the factory or to observe the airships in flight. And in his seminal history of the Parseval airships, Alistair Reid observes that the Kaiser's interest led to a great deal of discussion in Germany about the future for airships, and highlighted a growing divide among army officers as to the superiority of Count von Zeppelin's rigid airships versus Parseval's non-rigid airships and the semi-rigid airships built by a guy called Major Gross. This led to the first ever German military airship manoeuvres in October and November of 1909 to try and help settle the debate. Observed by guests from around the world, including Winston Churchill and Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria, two Parseval airships, a Zeppelin and one of Major Gross's semi-rigids, performed speed, endurance and lifting capacity tests, as well as making a mock night attack on a fortress. Parseval airship pilot August Stelling describes flying the PL-3 during these manoeuvres in an endurance flight with no objective other than to remain aloft for as long as possible. In incredibly thick fog, and with almost zero visibility, Stelling decided to land. He wrote, "Now we had to be very careful. You literally could not see your hand in front of your face in the thick fog. Slowly, I took the airship down, having absolutely no idea what lay beneath us. Suddenly, at 50 meters, we saw the chimney of a factory go past at close hand. In the next instant, we saw a farmstead surrounded by large trees. With a loud crash, the gondola struck the top of one of them. Luckily, just beyond the farm, there was a clear area. We caught the attention of people below, alerted by the noise, and the next moment they were pulling on the drag ropes and hauling us down. Once on the ground, we secured the airship. The whole process had happened in a very short space of time and clearly demonstrated how difficult it can be to land without being able to see anything, and also that a pilot must be prepared for unpleasant surprises." The manoeuvres ended with a parade of all four airships over Cologne Cathedral, which must have been quite a sight. Although primarily constructed for military purposes, Parseval dabbled with commercial operations, and with some success. Through 1910, the PL-5 made a tour across Germany. It would be brought to a town by rail, inflated, and then would offer passenger flights for a few days, for up to 4 passengers at a time, before being deflated and moved on to the next town. The airship was a palpable hit, but came to an untimely end in the town of Minden. Whilst the airship was being deflated, the hydrogen was set alight by a thoughtless cigarette smoker. The fire destroyed the airship and injured several bystanders. One significant commercial innovation was the use of the PL-6 for aerial advertising. But this wasn't just a banner attached to the airship's hull. This was a sophisticated projection system designed by the fabulously named Herr Wankmuller, allowing company logos and slogans to be projected onto white screens attached to either side of the envelope, brightly lit and standing out perfectly in the night sky. PL-6 flew many advertising missions over Berlin and Hamburg, advertising products such as chocolate and cakes, and prefiguring the internal lighting systems used on modern airships. At the outbreak of war, the German armed forces had 3 Parseval airships at their disposal, with 1 more on order. A small number of Parseval airships would see service in the war, but fairly swiftly, the German High Command transferred its support primarily to the rigid airship. It was not the end for August von Parseval's airship story, though. We will catch up with him, eventually, after the war. I mentioned earlier that Count von Zeppelin was not the only German manufacturer of rigid airships. Engineer Johann Schutt readily admitted that he lived, quote, in the shadow of the Titan, and he was a great admirer of the Count, even if perhaps that admiration was unrequited. Schutt, like Hugo Eckener, grew up in northern Germany and spent much of his time sailing in the North Sea, which led him to study naval architecture and eventually to specialize in the water resistance of ships' hulls. After the LZ-4 crashed in spectacular style at Echterdingen in 1908, Schutte realised that there were many ways he could apply his shipbuilding expertise to the problem of airship construction. He wrote a memorandum less than a week after the disaster, proposing several improvements to basic Zeppelin designs, including a strong keel, single-unit horizontal and vertical stabilizers at the stern only, and propellers attached directly to engines rather than the engines driving propellers attached to the hull. Schutte sent these suggestions to Count von Zeppelin, who rejected them. But Schutte had got the airship bug and could not let go, and I know what that feels like. Receiving encouragement from the German government, who perhaps relished the idea of an airship manufacturer less persistent and, frankly, less difficult than Count von Zeppelin, and receiving financial backing from industrious Karl Lanz, the Schutte Lanz Airship Works was founded in April 1909 and work began on the SL-1. A significant design choice, one which Henry Cordmeyer describes as ultimately the Achilles heel for Schutte Lanz, was the decision to use plywood girders rather than metal. But SL-1 was markedly different in appearance from the Zeppelins. It was streamlined with a striking geodesic rigid frame, and its system of elevators and rudders was simple in contrast to the often messy, boxy structures found on Zeppelins. It first flew in October 1911, but it was lost at its moorings in a violent storm in December 1912, but not before the German army had given Schutte Lanz a contract for another airship. SL-2, launched in February 1914, contained even more innovations than SL-1. Douglas Robinson calls it the first modern airship. Streamlined further than SL-1, including streamlined gondolas and engine cars, SL-2 also incorporated a triangular keel running the length of the airship's interior, enclosed vertical shafts for valving gas, and a simple cruciform tailplane. Each engine car also contained a heavy machine gun for defence. These innovations would shape the future of all rigid airships. It would not be long before Schutte Lanz airships would be tested in battle, and we will see how they got on in Season 2. But the airship daddy was, and always would be, the Zeppelin Company. Initially, Zeppelin's main military customer was the German army. Up to the outbreak of the war, Zeppelin would construct 13 airships for the German army and only 3 for the navy, 2 of which would be destroyed in catastrophic incidents. But during the war itself, the focus would very much shift to the navy as the Zeppelin stepped into the strategic bombing and reconnaissance roles it was most suited to. We've already covered some of the Army's involvement in airships. The LZ-3 performed sterling service as a training ship until 1913. The LZ-5 ended its career draped across a railway embankment in 1910. But perhaps the most consequential pre-war Army Zeppelin was the LZ-16, delivered in March 1913. Less than a month after it commenced service, LZ-16 was involved in an unusual and far-reaching diplomatic incident that would have connotations for the global airship industry. On the 2nd of April, LZ-16 took off from Friedrichshafen bound for the fortress of Metz, then German territory, under the command of Oberleutnant Jacobi. Overnight, the wind shifted. A thick fog sprung up and, unbeknownst to the crew, the airship steadily drifted off course. As dawn broke and visibility improved, to his horror, Jacobi realised he was flying over France without permission, potentially a very serious diplomatic incident. Hoping to avoid such an incident, he landed voluntarily at the cavalry grounds of the border town of Luneville. Seizing their opportunity to learn from the masters, the French immediately sent for their most experienced airship mechanics, and, according to the New York Times of the 4th of May, engineers from the Lebaudy and Clement Bayard works arrived and began pouring over the German airship. The result was a very detailed set of drawings of this state-of-the-art Zeppelin, which were shared with the British and which would heavily influence future British rigid airship designs. The Germans were furious, not least because, when it was eventually released, the airship had been covered with signatures and slogans, some patriotic, some not terribly polite, scrawled by its temporary French captors. Unlike in Great Britain, the Imperial German Army was the senior service, with the Imperial German Navy, junior, in status, and perhaps that explains the significant early imbalance between the numbers of Army and Navy airships. Ironically, the British identified the Zeppelin's potential naval value before the German Navy itself, noting in particular their potential use as aerial naval scouts in the North Sea, with a single airship able to do the work of several more expensive surface vessels. In his superb history of the German Naval Airship Division, Douglas Robertson explains that the blocker was the figure who towered over the German Navy during this period, Admiral Alfred von Tirpitz, Kaiser Wilhelm's naval minister and the man responsible for building the Imperial German Navy into a formidable fighting force. Tirpitz was intensely conservative and wary of spending money on novel gadgets such as airships, even if he could see the theoretical value in an airship large enough and with great enough range. Tirpitz watched the early Zeppelins with a dubious eye, observing after the loss of the LZ-4 that the thing itself is not very safe. Whether the concept is safe is very much in dispute. We've seen, though, how strongly the public supported Count von Zeppelin and how much of a patriotic symbol his airships had become. It was this, coupled with pressure from the Kaiser himself, that ultimately persuaded Tirpitz to give Zeppelins a chance. An order was placed in April 1912 and construction began, very discreetly, on a naval airship base at Nordholz on the North Sea coast. The first naval airship, given the tactical designation of L1, made her first flight on the 7th of October 1912 and 6 days later made an endurance flight with Count von Zeppelin in command. The 30-hour flight caused a minor bout of mass hysteria in England, with people in the Kentish Medway town of Sheerness insisting that they had seen or heard the L1 fly over, even though she had been nowhere near the town. L1's primary duty was training the officers and crews of potential future airships, and she made numerous flights for this purpose, putting the airship leaders of the future through their paces. One such officer was a young guy named Heinrich Mathy, a brilliant leader and a fearless and formidable commander of Zeppelins in war times. Remember that name for the next season. Tirpitz seemed convinced by what he saw from the L1. Unlike the somewhat haphazard efforts seen in Britain and indeed in the German army, Tirpitz outlined a detailed 5-year plan to supercharge the Navy's airship capabilities. They would purchase 10 Zeppelins, beef up the base at Nordholz, and subsidize private hangars for use in wartime. The 5-year plan also formally established the Naval Airship Division. The first ship of this plan, the L2, began construction in May 1913. The design, though, was not without controversy. The size of the airship was tightly constrained by the hangar in which she would be based. To allow for a slightly larger ship, the Navy's own naval architect, Felix Pietzker, insisted that the Zeppelin company placed the gondolas closer against the underside of the hull than they normally would. This saved space, but meant spark-chugging engines slung very close to 27,000 cubic meters of highly flammable hydrogen. Pietzker also insisted on wraparound windscreens on each engine car, reaching up to the underside of the hull. The Zeppelin team were not happy, but felt they had little choice but to acquiesce. While L2 was under construction, L1 was busily continuing her training schedule and performed well enough that Tirpitz decided to include her in the autumn naval maneuvers. On the 8th of September, she reported the position of the enemy fleet ahead of the surface scouts, a significant victory for the concept of the rigid airship as a naval scout. The following day, 20 officers and men under the command of Captain Lieutenant Hannay took off for another scouting mission. She ascended in pleasant weather and cruised towards the island of Heligoland in the North Sea. But reports came in of heavy winds, and at 6:30 p.m. a vicious storm struck the L1. She was buffeted by a series of up and down drafts, pushing her at first close to the surface of the roiling sea and then pulling her up beyond her pressure height, causing hydrogen to be valved automatically and critically reducing her lift. Captain Lieutenant Hannay realized he was losing control of his ship. He dropped ballast and ordered fuel tanks to be dropped, but it was too late. the L1 plunged bow first into the sea and broke up into two sections. The gondolas were pushed beneath the waves, trapping and drowning the occupants. Although a trawler was on scene in 10 minutes, only 6 of the 20 on board were saved. The 14 who perished were the first people to die in a Zeppelin. It was a sobering moment for the Zeppelin Company, for the Navy, and for the public at large. Hugo Eckener was fiercely critical of the Navy's handling of the L1, saying that she was overloaded, which she was given the conditions. The Navy felt the loss not only of the airship itself, but also of the officers and men they had so painstakingly trained. In a rather strange coincidence, the flight of the L2 was on the 9th of September, the same day that the L1 was lost over the North Sea. L2 quickly commenced a schedule of training flights similar to those conducted by the L1. On the 17th of October 1913, L2 was taken out of a hangar for her 10th flight. She had a large complement of officers and men on board, 28 in total, including a group from the Zeppelin Company and a group from the Admiralty, among which was Felix Pietzke, the officer who had demanded design changes in the face of opposition from the Zeppelin Company. After a delay of several hours to repair a faulty engine, L2 took off from her base, 9 miles southeast of Berlin, and circled over the airfield while climbing to almost 1,000 feet, watched by a crowd of several thousand onlookers. Admiration turned to horror as observers noticed a lick of flame from the forward engine gondola, followed by an explosion. Suddenly, the airship was burning along its entire length and dropping out of the sky. As it fell, a second explosion overwhelmed the senses of those on the ground. The blast shattered windows half a mile away and threw several crew members of the airship a quarter of a mile. The airship, trailing a long cloud of smoke, hit the ground, engulfed in searingly hot flames. All 28 of the people on board were killed. Again, Eckener blasted the Navy. Felix Pietzke had perished in the crash, but Eckener blamed his forced design changes for the disaster. The large windscreens on the gondola had formed a vacuum into which hydrogen had been drawn. This was ignited by the forward engine, making the destruction of the ship inevitable. Count von Zeppelin and Admiral Tirpitz had an angry and public exchange of words at the funeral for the crew of the L2, causing an alarmed Alfred Kolsman to step in and calm them down. It was a bitter, bitter blow. With two disasters following each other in quick succession, the Naval Airship Division found itself without any airships, and even worse, with almost no trained officers or men. There was a chance that the whole organisation could have ceased to exist were it not for the force of personality of its commander, a man who had only been in post for a few weeks and who would, over the course of the next few years, shape the Naval Airship Division into an efficient, tight-knit, deadly military unit. This was Korvettenkapitan Peter Strasser, and we will hear a lot more about him in Season 2. After the loss of the L2, Strasser steadied the nerves of the remaining men of the Naval Airship Division and of the Admiralty. They would proceed as planned. The Navy ordered another airship from the Zeppelin Company, who this time refused to accept any design changes, and the L3 was launched on the 11th of May 1914, shortly afterwards making a successful 35-hour endurance flight. L3 participated in Kiel Week, the annual naval review which kicked off on the 24th of June as a bit of a mutual love-in between the Germans and the British, who were present with a squadron of dreadnoughts. The Kaiser appeared in the uniform of a British admiral, toasts were drunk to the navies of both countries, parties and balls were held, and a fabulous time was had by sailors of both nationalities. Given the rising tensions of the last few years, there must have been an air of unreality to all this jollity and mutual backslapping. We can only imagine how surreal it must have been for the German and British attendees at Kiel Week to receive news on the 28th of June of the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and his wife Sophie in Sarajevo that morning, victims of a Serbian gunman. The impact of this event was not clear immediately. The last few years had seen several high-profile assassinations and even outright conflict, but things had never spiraled into all-out Europe-wide war. In his book Dance of the Furies, Michael Nyberg quotes a Kiel Week attendee as saying, "I'm quite sure not a soul of us held himself capable of imagining that because of this remote felony, Great Britain and Germany would be at war 5 weeks later." But the assassination sparked a diplomatic flurry that grew into a storm, and finally a furious tempest as nations issued ultimatums and in turn mobilized their forces. Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia on the 28th of July. Russia, Serbia's allies, mobilized their formidable armies on the 30th of July. The following day, Germany mobilized its forces, and their ultimatum to Russia to cease hostile actions against Austria-Hungary and Germany having gone unanswered, they declared war on the 1st of August. France refused a German demand to remain neutral, so German forces were now mobilized against their western neighbour, and they declared war on the 3rd of August. The following day, German troops invaded Belgium en route to France, a violation of Belgian sovereignty that the British had pledged to uphold. So on the 4th of August, the last domino fell as Britain declared war on Germany. Sir Edward Grey, the British Foreign Secretary, gazing out of his office window at the Westminster lamplighters on the evening of the 3rd of August, famously remarked, "The lamps are going out all over Europe. We shall not see them lit again in our lifetimes." Europe was at war in what was to become one of the darkest periods of human history, the calamity from which all other calamities sprang. In Germany, in Britain, in France, and Italy, airshipmen paused for a moment, waiting for their nations to summon them to duty. They looked to the future with uncertainty. What part would they play in the conflict? What roles would their airships be assigned? How would the war affect the development of airship technology? Who, indeed, would live to see peace again? The First World War would see airships deployed as terrifying strategic bombers, as far-sighted naval scouts, as effective submarine spotters and convoy escorts. Many airshipmen would die horrible, fiery deaths, and hundreds of civilians would be killed in bombing raids. The airship world, up to now a rather cosy community of eccentrics and amateurs, would never be the same again. I hope you enjoyed this look at how the airship fleets of Europe prepared for the challenge of war. And this episode is actually the last main episode of Season 1, but look out for a final bonus episode, a fun interview with Toby Page, CEO of Skyship Services. I'm then going to take some time out to read and research for Season 2, which is all about airships in the First World War. And as we close Season 1, I'd like to thank everyone who listens to this podcast. I have loved writing, researching, and recording these episodes. It's given me an opportunity to re-engage with the history of an aircraft I've loved since I was a small boy. So thank you so much for your support. If you are enjoying the podcast and would like to show your appreciation, you can buy me a coffee at ko-fi.com/upshippod. And many thanks to listeners Mark, Russell, Brian, and Victor, who did just that. You can email the podcast at upshippodcast@gmail.com. You can find us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter at upshippod. I hope you enjoyed your flight with us today. Thank you very much for listening. Please remember to like, subscribe, and review, and join me next time for more aerial adventures on Upship, the Airship History Podcast.